Yay, it's the Meno. Yay. This is not, strictly speaking, uh, necessary for anybody. This is sort of my own interpretation of the Meno. It's a little bit maybe odd. It's a little idiosyncratic. If you look at what's her face's little introduction to the Meno in the Hackett Five Dialogues book, pardon me. Ugh, that's what you get for being awake for 5 hours already when it's 8:30 in the morning. Um, they connect it to later dialogues that are more Plato than Socratic, and I suppose that's true. Um, where we get more of Platonic forms and less of historical Socrates. So this is that makes Meno a kind of transitional dialogue from Socrates being more like Socrates, and Socrates being more like um, the stock character for Plato, and voice of Plato. I don't know. I'm not an ancient philosophy scholar, and this is just sort of me dealing with the Meno. Um, so here goes nothing. So the first question that Meno asks is, can you tell me, can virtue be taught, or is it not teachable with the result of practice, or is it neither of these, but men possess it by nature or in some other way? Now, one of the things I think is interesting about this is to ask why Meno asks this question. Is it in order to um, learn something about virtue? Um, and I think that Plato indicates something to us about Meno and about why Meno asks this question in Socrates' answer. And we get it from the number of times Socrates mentions the word reputation and being admired and so forth already in this initial response. And in Meno's response to Socrates' response. So Socrates responds by saying that they've had a high reputation, the Thessalians. Remember that Meno's from Thessaly. Admired for their wisdom, um, horsemanship, their wealth. Um, and the responsibility for this reputation comes from Gorgias, who came to their city, and Aristippus, who taught and was the lover of Meno, was loved for his wisdom, and the other Thessalians agreed. And Aristippus accustomed you to give bold and grand answers to any question that may be asked. Okay, so a bold and grand answer, as experts are likely to do. So that's a hint that Plato gives us, and that's going to come back several times. This bold answer, this grand answer that Aristippus taught Meno and others to give to every kind of question. But in comparison, Socrates says, here in Athens, my dear Meno, the opposite is the case, as if there were a dearth of wisdom, and wisdom seems to have departed hence to go to you. If you want to ask one of us that sort of question, everyone will laugh and say, good stranger, you must think me happy indeed if you think I know whether virtue can be taught or how it comes to be. I'm so far from knowing whether virtue can be taught or not that I do not even have any knowledge of what virtue itself is. I myself, am as poor as my fellow citizens in this matter, and I blame myself for my complete ignorance about virtue. If I do not know what something is, how could I know what qualities it possesses? Now, look at Meno's response to this. Socrates, do you really not know what virtue is? Are we to report this to the folks back home about you? So immediately, Meno gets at, well, is that what, do you want me to tell others about this? This is what you want me to tell them? So I suggest that Meno asks about Socrates, or asks Socrates this question in order to say something about his having encountered Socrates to the people back in Thessaly. They would have known about Socrates. Socrates was not an unknown person. In fact, he was probably kind of famous beyond Athens because he was a pain in the ass, and people knew that about him. Something else happens right at the very beginning. Well, in addition, when Socrates responds to that by saying, not only do I not know what virtue is, I don't believe I've met anybody who did. And Meno says, didn't you meet Gorgias when he was here? And Socrates says, yeah, I met him. And Meno says, didn't you think he knew what virtue was? And Socrates says, here's another theme coming up right away at the beginning of the dialogue. I don't remember. Why don't you remind me what he said? So that's this other theme, the theme of remembering and recollecting, that comes up right at the beginning of the dialogue. But remember, I said the beginnings of dialogues and the ends of dialogues and the middles of dialogues tell us a lot about what's going on in the whole dialogue. So here's the beginning. We've got the theme of reputation, the theme having to do with giving bold answers to questions versus having a dearth of wisdom or seeming to have a dearth of wisdom, not knowing what something is because you don't know what qualities it possesses. So this puzzle about knowing, the theme of recollecting. So then Socrates says, this is so bizarre. This is such a weird kind of non sequitur. If you look at this, Meno says, didn't you meet Gorgias when he was here? Socrates responds, yeah, I met him. Maybe you can remind me what Gorgias says. And maybe you, if you're willing, you can share his views. And Meno says, yeah, I do. I can tell you that. And then Socrates immediately says, let's leave Gorgias out of it since he's not here. That's really odd. And I think something is going on there that's a little peculiar. Anyway, he says, but by the gods, Meno, what do you say virtue is? Speak, don't begrudge us. Tell us what you think. Prove to me that I said something untrue when I said I'd never met anyone who knew, if you and Gorgias are shown to know. And now Gorgias is back in it. So what's going on? Do we care about what Gorgias said, or do we not care about what Gorgias said? Why is Socrates playing this weird little game with Gorgias? I think there is something going on there. So Meno says, well, it's not hard to tell you, Socrates. If you want the virtue of a man, it's easy to say. Virtue is being able to manage public affairs, doing so to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, be careful no harm comes to himself, etc., etc., etc. So just like Socrates has just now said about how Aristippus taught people, Meno has a ready answer. So it's like Socrates has told him this is the kind of answer he's going to give. You know, Aristippus taught you to give bold answers, and then Meno starts giving a bold answer just right away. Socrates knows Meno already, having just met him, which is pretty interesting because, or do you think that someone who does not know at all who Meno is could know whether he is good looking or rich or well born, or the opposite of these? Socrates knows that Aristippus was Meno's teacher, and so he knows Meno's going to give an answer like Aristippus does. Pretty smart. Now I'm going to skip to the very end of the dialogue. Let's see where these go. I'm going to start with, all right. So Anytus, at the very end of the dialogue, leaves angry. Socrates is just bad in asking Anytus about all the different kinds of great men in Athens who have crappy sons who turned out to be awful. So, you know, a terrific dad, a great statesman of Athens, all around terrific guy, crapo son who can't even ride a horse and is, you know, out just boning everything that can move and whatever. And Anita says, I think, Socrates, that you easily speak ill of people. I would advise you, if you listen to me, to be careful. Well, we know that Anytus and Meletus, whose house they're in, are the prosecutors of Socrates in the Apology. What is Anytus concerned with? You speak ill of people. Reputation. And Socrates says, I think, Meno, that Anytus is angry. Yeah, duh, Socrates. And I'm not at all surprised. He thinks to begin with that I'm slandering those men, and then he believes himself to be one of them. In fact, Socrates never said anything ill of Anytus, though inside story, Anytus had one of those crappy sons. If he ever realizes what slander is, he will cease from anger, but he does not know it now. So, moving on, they talk about Gorgias again being a good teacher because he doesn't promise to teach people virtue. He teaches people to be clever speakers, just like Aristippus. And then they start getting into the idea of intelligence and knowledge and so forth. And they come back to another paradox about knowledge. Socrates at 96a has this interesting thing to say about knowledge and virtue. Can you mention any other subject of which those who claim to be teachers not only are not recognized to be teachers of others, but are not recognized to have knowledge of it themselves, and are thought to be poor in the very matter which they profess to teach, or any other subject of which those who are recognized as worthy teachers at one time say it can be taught, and at other times that it cannot? So the paradox is the people who profess the knowledge seem to be poor in the very matter they profess to teach. Or they sometimes say you can teach it, and other times that they can't teach it. What? Then who is it who professes to know virtue? Now, who is it who professes not to know virtue? In this dialogue, the one who professes not to know virtue is Socrates. The one who professes to know what virtue is, and at times to not know what virtue is, at times to claim that it can be taught, and at times to know that it can't be taught, is Meno. So Meno is the one that Socrates is in this paragraph likening most to one of the sophists, who at one time has one view, at another time another view, professes one thing, professes another thing, has no consistency of position, doesn't seem even concerned about a consistency of position. They might be recognized to be teachers, but at the same time, not to have what they claim to teach. That'll come up in the middle of the dialogue as well. Then they talk about there being no teachers and being no pupils of virtue. And if there's no teachers and no pupils of virtue, then virtue can't be a kind of knowledge. So if it's not a kind of knowledge, then what is it? And that gets us into the difference between knowledge and giving correct direction, that is, knowledge versus right opinion or true opinion. So the difference between a man who knew the way to Larissa versus someone who had a correct opinion of the way to Larissa is, I want to modernize that to kind of get at what we're talking about. Now, I moved here from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I drove the entire way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to here. So, in that sense, I know the way from Pittsburgh to here. And so I know the way from here to Pittsburgh. I could drive to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I could just do it. Another person could have a correct opinion about driving to Pittsburgh without knowing the way. in that they could have a GPS system directing them, they could have a map, or they could know generally Pittsburgh is east by northeast from here. They could know where Pennsylvania is, generally speaking. We could still both get there. One person would have knowledge of how to get there, the other would have a true opinion of how to get there. Another example, um, I have several times made from scratch um, homemade um, macaroni and cheese, with the white sauce and melting the cheese in it and the breadcrumbs in it and the whole thing. It's quite good. It's decadent. The secret to mine is freshly grated nutmeg. You're welcome. It's awesome that way. So I know how to make. I don't consult a recipe. I don't need a recipe schmecipe. I just go into the kitchen and start banging pots and pans together, and I'm making my damn mac and cheese. I don't need any recipe, but you could make it if you had the correct opinion as to how to make it. And a correct opinion could be having a recipe. That's the kind of difference. Having a recipe or any other kind of right opinion as a guide would get you there just as well as the knowledge would. So a true opinion is, in that sense, just as good as knowledge. So why is one more valuable than the other? Meno asks. They're equal as guides. Why is one more valuable? And Socrates says, well, you want to know why? Because I will tell you. And he says, maybe they don't have statues of Daedalus where you are. Now, Daedalus was the one who built the wings that Icarus was famous for stealing and flying towards the sun with, wings made with birds' feathers and wax. And he flew too close to the sun, they melted, and Icarus fell, and kaboom. So the statue of Daedalus isn't worth much unless it's tied down, because the statue will fly away. That was the cute little folkloric thing that they used to do. I think that's kind of cute. So they tied down these statues. The metaphor is true opinions, as long as they remain, are a fine and good thing, and they do good, but they're not willing to remain long. They escape from a person's mind. So they're not worth much until they're tied down by giving an account of the reason why. So what's the difference between having a recipe and knowing how to cook great mac and cheese? Here is the difference. I know why the roux works the way it works, and why you don't want to put the milk in cold, and if it is too cold, how to fix that, and how the cheese should melt. And I know how and why all that stuff works the way it does. And if you're just using a recipe, you may not know, right? The knowing why, the account of the reasons why, is the difference between knowledge and just the opinion. Now, he's talking about something that's way more, abstract, you might say, way more conceptual than cooking or driving to Pittsburgh or going to Larissa. But it's the same idea. It's the same basic idea. Being virtuous, you could have just an account of you could have a guide to being virtuous. You could have a guide to being brave, for instance. You could have a model of bravery. And you could even follow that model of bravery well and do well following that model of bravery. But suppose that model of bravery then, as people do, dies. Then maybe that model starts to become dim in your awareness. You start to lose track of how your model of bravery really did behave. And you start to become a little ruder, a little rasher, less brave and more kind of stupid or brutal or something, then you're less brave at that point and you've become something else, something more monstrous or something like that. If you understood the reasons why of bravery, then you would really be virtuous. You would have the knowledge of virtue. That's the kind of distinction that Socrates is drawing here. After they're tied down, in the first place, they become knowledge and they remain in place. Secondly, he says, that is recollection. Look at what Meno says. Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, it seems to be something like that. And look at what Socrates says right after that. This is awesome. Indeed, I too speak as one who does not have knowledge, but is guessing. However, I certainly do think I'm not, I certainly do not think I'm guessing that right opinion is a different thing from knowledge. If I claim to know anything else, and I would make that claim about few things, I would put this down as one of the things I know. So, knowledge is true opinion tied down by an account of the reason why. So, if virtue is not taught through knowledge, where does it come from? It's not through knowledge. The only alternative is that it's right opinion that statesmen follow for the right course for their cities. As regards knowledge, they're no different from soothsayers and prophets. They too say many things true and inspired, but they've got no knowledge of what they're saying. And so, it's right to call divine these men who, without an understanding, are right in much that is of importance in what they say or do. And Meno responds, certainly. So if you're virtuous, not because you've been taught it and not through knowledge, it must just be divinely inspired. So if virtue isn't taught, it's not a form of knowledge, it's not an inborn quality, it must be a gift from the gods. In fact, Socrates concludes with that. It follows from this reasoning, Meno, that virtue appears to be present in those of us who may possess it as a gift from the gods. Wow. Well, that language is repeated almost verbatim in the Apology, where following Socrates's conviction for corrupting the youth of Athens, for violating the religious laws of the state of Athens, there is a penalty phase of the trial. And for his sentence, Socrates proposes being given free meals as a hero, as an Olympic hero would, and being celebrated as a gift of the gods to the city of Athens. Plato would count on his readers knowing that. And so Plato, including this language in the Meno, is cluing us in that Socrates in this dialogue is, in a sense, representing virtue. So all along, Socrates is representing what virtue is. He is being a model of virtue in this dialogue. I think that's important because all along, what does Socrates do with Meno? He keeps asking Meno to keep looking for what virtue is. Something else interesting at the very end. There aren't many dialogues where Socrates says, I gotta go. Almost always it's somebody else. Almost always. And in all of the Socratic dialogues, practically at least, almost all of them, the other person leaves extremely annoyed. The only other one that I can think of that is not like that is the one where Socrates dies. The very end of this dialogue, Socrates says to Meno, if you convince Anytus that, I'm going to, that of what you've been convinced here, you'll confer a great benefit upon the Athenians. That benefit being that Socrates, as a gift of the gods, will be a benefit to the Athenians in general. So all of that is sort of inside baseball that Plato's readers would know. Now let's talk about the middle of the dialogue. All right, by the middle of the dialogue, Meno is fed up. Meno says, "You've made me numb, I'm perplexed. You look like a torpedo fish," which is a kind of a ray. So he's insulting Socrates. He's saying he looks like a stingray. Socrates had a broad face, especially his nose. He was not a very pretty person by Athenian standards. Um, and Meno says, "Yet I have made many speeches about virtue before large audience on 1,000 occasions. Very good speeches, as I thought. But now I can't even say what it is." Well, yeah, he was trained by Aristippus to do that. So, of course, the dancing bear was used to doing his tricks in front of people. And now he's stunned and he's annoyed at Socrates for doing this to him. "I think you're wise not to sail away from Athens to go and stay elsewhere. For if you were to behave like this as a stranger in another city, you'd be driven away for practicing sorcery." Socrates says, "You're a rascal. You nearly deceived me. I know why you drew this image of me, so I would draw an image of you in return. So, well, I'm not going to do it. Now, if the broad torpedo fish is numb and therefore makes others numb, then I'll resemble it. But otherwise, no way. But I don't have the answer myself when I perplex others. So now I don't know what virtue is. Maybe you did before you contacted me, but now you're certainly like one who does not know. You are certainly like one who does not know." That's a weird phrase. "Nonetheless, I want to examine and seek together with you what it may be." Still wants to look for it together. Why? So far, Meno has not been a very good interlocutor. He hasn't been a lot of help looking for virtue. His definitions of virtue have been pretty crap. He hasn't seemed to be very attentive to the problems with his definitions of virtue. That's my opinion, anyway. I don't see Meno being helpful, even really trying to be helpful in the first half of the dialogue. I think he's being kind of snotty to Socrates and just getting more and more irritated. He wanted to give a Aristippus kind of answer. He wanted to give a fine speech about virtue. And Socrates kept saying, I don't want a fine speech. I want a definition. I don't want a theatrical answer. I want a definition. And as much as he tried to explain the kind of definition he was after, kept saying, I don't get it. I don't get it. Until, just kind of blew up at him. And he still wants to seek together with him? Why? I'll get to that. Because I have an answer to that. I do. And then Meno says, "How will you look for it, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you should meet with it, how will you know that this is the thing that you did not know?" And Socrates says, "I know what you want to say, Meno. Do you realize what a debater's argument you were bringing up, that a man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know? He cannot search for what he knows, since he knows that there is no need to search, nor for what he does not know, or he does not know what to look for." Those are slightly different. And what Socrates said at the beginning is more like what Meno says. What Socrates said at the beginning was about Meno. How would I know who Meno is if I didn't know characteristics about Meno? It's kind of the same rhetorical gambit that Meno is making here. And it's key to this dialogue. If we don't know that we can find it, That's really the issue. If we don't know that we can find it, how do we, why do we believe that we can successfully keep looking? Why keep looking if we don't know we can find it? Is really the question. But it's being shifted into a specific direction that does make it just a debater's trick. Um, I mean, it's this can simply be refuted if it's put in these terms. For instance, I used to do this in class. I would stand in front of the class and say, "All right, I have something in my pocket, my pants pocket. You don't know what it is. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You're not allowed to look in my pants pocket. What is it? Is it literally the case that you don't know what it is and you can't know anything about it? Of course not, because you can know it's small enough and light enough that I can carry it in my pants pocket. You know that it's probably not a living creature, or if it is, it's one that doesn't mind hanging out in my pants pocket. You know it is probably not a liquid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can know a lot about it without yet knowing what it is. And by knowing those things about it, you can narrow down where you're searching quite a lot. Meno is proposing a kind of on and off switch of knowledge where you either have it or you don't have it. Like, as though finding virtue, knowledge of virtue, is like finding your car keys, you know? But even finding your car keys, you know ways, strategies for searching. And you don't, if you've lost your car keys, you don't stand there and think, oh, well, there's no way to look for them because I haven't got them. That's not what we do. So it's obviously false. But Socrates has also shifted what Meno is really asking about. And what Meno's really asking about, he hasn't really expressed quite well. Let me go back to the beginning to show you. See, this is the question. If you think I can know whether virtue can be taught, I'm so far from knowing whether virtue can be taught, I don't even know what virtue itself is. If I do not know what something is, how could I know what properties or qualities it possesses? I don't know what it is. How can I know the qualities it possesses? If I don't know at all who Meno is, how could I know whether he's good looking or rich or well born? Okay. If I don't know what virtue is, how can I know whether it's teachable? Back to the middle again. I don't know what it is. I'm suggesting Meno's question is really like this. If I don't know what it is, how do I know whether it's searchable? Whether it has the quality searchable? I think that's very similar question to what Socrates asked about virtue before. If I don't know what virtue is, how do I know whether it's teachable? If I don't know what it is, how do I look for it? That seems very similar. And then Socrates says, yeah, I can refute that. Here we go. Here's the refutation. It's the slave boy thing in the middle of the dialogue. I've heard wise men and women talk about divine matters. Meno interrupts. What do they say? Socrates, what was, I thought, both true and beautiful. This is totally out of character with Socrates in any of the dialogues that are historical dialogues. It's really out of character for Socrates in most of the dialogues, full stop. Meno, Who was it? And what was it? And who were they? Again, reputation. That's what he cares about. Socrates. The speakers were among the priests and priestesses whose care it is to be able to give an account of their practices. Pindar too says it, and many others of the divine among our poets. So are these good sources or not good sources? Or okay. As the soul is immortal, has been born often, and has seen all things here and in the underworld, there is nothing which it has not learned. Okay. So it's not surprising that it can recollect the things it knew before, both about virtue and other things. As the whole of nature is akin, the soul has learned everything. Nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, process men call learning, discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire of the search. For searching and learning are, as a whole, recollection. We must not, therefore, believe that debater's argument, for it would make us idle and faint-hearted men like to hear it, whereas my argument makes us energetic and keen on the search. I trust that this is true. I trust that this is true. Well, what? So, really? I think there's something really weird about this idea. Not just the idea of um, reincarnation that it involves, but the having learned everything. When would it have learned all these things? If learning is recollecting from a prior time, then every time that the soul exists here and in the underworld, its learning is recalling things it knew before. If its learning always is recalling things it knew before, then it would have to always have known them, or else we have an infinite regress problem. There would have to always be yet another previous life in which it would be learning the things that it would then be recalling in the next life. So this recollection business, I think, has some internal logical problems to it. Let's move on. All right. So then Socrates, can you teach me this is so? Meno says. And then Socrates says, oh, you're a rascal. You ask if I can teach you this, but teaching nothing but recollection. So if I do it, I'll be contradicting myself. And Meno says, no, it's just a force of habit. It's just how we talk. And he says, all right. Give me a slave boy. And off we go into this geometry thing. Um, Plato was into math and thought that arithmetic, geometry, and so forth were steps in a kind of dialectic towards the ideal forms. At least that's what some people say. I don't know. So some people think that the whole geometry bit in this dialogue has some kind of connection with Pythagoras and numbers and all that. I have no idea what's up with that. I don't care. So, all right. He's dealing with the slave boy and he's talking about the 8-foot square, and he's definitely not teaching, right? Definitely not. So he gets to the point where the slave boy has finally become perplexed, just like the torpedo fish is. And then Socrates says, we've probably achieved something relevant to finding out how matters stand. For now, as he does not know, he would be glad to find out. Whereas before, he thought he could easily make many fine speeches to large audiences about the square of double size and said that it must have a base twice as long. Meno says, so it seems. So Socrates is making another reference to Aristippus trained Meno. And he's making fun of Meno, but also look at the difference, big difference between Meno and the slave boy. The boy is willing to learn. He would be glad to find out. Meno was ready to give up and said, well, how are we going to find it? Socrates says, do you think that before he would have tried to find out, before he fell into perplexity and realized that he did not know and longed to know? Has he then benefited from being numbed? Meno says, yeah, I guess so. Look then how he'll come out of perplexity while searching along with me. I shall do nothing more than ask questions and not teach him. Watch whether you find me teaching and explaining things to him instead of asking for his opinion. Well, to me, it's patently obvious that Socrates is teaching and explaining things to him. Um, After all, he shows him where to draw the line, etc., etc. Was the slave boy only giving his own opinions? Did he recall in some way? I don't know. I don't think so, not really. Does it matter? I think the point is that something like recalling is going on when we learn. It's the getting it moment. Because when you learn something, truly learn it, there is a feeling of it being something that you always knew. Um, the way that something like um, multiplying 3 and 7 together to get 21, if that's something that your brain just has absorbed, you don't even think it. It just is there. That's what I think could be going on there. Let's move on. Then, if the truth about reality is always in our soul, the soul would be immortal, so that you should always confidently try to seek out and recollect. You should always confidently try to seek out and recollect what you do not know at present. That's the message of this whole recollection myth. So Socrates says, I think so too, that what I'm saying is right now. I do not insist that my argument is right in all other respects, i.e., the entire myth of recollection. But I would contend at all costs, in both word and deed, as far as I could, that we will be better men, braver and less idle, if we believe that one must search for the things that one does not know. So all of the rest of it, immortality of the soul, that we live in the underworld and the real world over and over and over again and learn all the things and then forget them when we're born and then recall them, and all of that could be 100% bullshit, but we'll be braver men, less idle, if we keep searching for the things that we don't know. That, I would contend at all costs, is true. Well, okay. So that's the real truth that he's after. All the rest of it could be a big old lie. And then, agrees. So we're of one mind. We're going to search for what virtue is. And then Meno says, sure. But I'd like to hear your answer to my original question, whether it's teachable or a gift or what. And then Socrates says, if I were directing you, not just myself, we'd investigate what virtue is first before moving on to this other thing. But you don't even attempt to rule yourself so that you can just be free, do whatever. Not only that, but you try to rule me. So I'll agree with you because what else can I do? So we must, it appear, inquire into the qualities of something, the nature of which we do not yet know. So note that Meno is not being ruled like the slave boy. He's not very teachable. He's ordering Socrates around. So in the slave boy business, that isn't an image of Meno at all. Socrates did not give an image of Meno in return. He told the truth there. He gave an image of himself. The slave boy image is an image of Socrates. Socrates guides himself. The slave boy's willing to learn. Meno won't even rule himself. He doesn't control himself. He doesn't care, which is why I think Meno is really a poor interlocutor throughout the whole dialogue. Throughout the whole dialogue. So let me get back to the ending. Gathering these things together. I think the myth of recollection is a lie, or it could certainly be a lie. Um, in other words, Socrates could disbelieve it himself, even as he tells it. The point of telling it is to try to get Meno to believe it. But what's the point of getting Meno to believe it? Well, that's the lie, right? The lie in this case is lying to Meno about recollection so that he will be braver and keener on the search. Socrates lies to him about there being a possibility of finding the truth about virtue in order to get Meno to keep looking for knowledge of virtue. Why? Generally, lies benefit the teller of lies. We lie because we aim to get benefit from lying. Socrates claims that this lie's effect is to make the person you're lying to braver and keener. So it really means there is a purpose to continue to think and discuss virtue, because if we do, we might recollect what it is. It means we're better off believing in the pursuit of this knowledge than in believing there's no way to learn it. It's a parable, the intent of which is the contrary of Meno's pessimism or cynicism about looking for definitions of virtue or quizzing people about their knowledge. More deeply, it's that belief itself fosters virtue. The belief, even if it's believing a lie, is what fosters the bravery of continuing to search. That's what Socrates says. Believing that it is possible to know is what makes them braver, more virtuous. So, this lie, the lie of the myth of recollection, provides an answer to Meno's initial question. How does virtue arise? One way it arises is by people believing lies that tell them that virtue and knowledge of virtue is possible. Why not say that right off the bat? Well, could that have been possible? Was didn't Meno need to become perplexed first? Because if he wasn't perplexed, he could not have been ready to learn the truth. He couldn't have been ready to develop virtue, not with regard to seeking knowledge. He had to become perplexed first. He had to be frustrated first, because only then would he have been prepared to hear this lie as a reason to keep going. He had to be desperate enough, in other words, which leads to knowledge and true opinion. True opinion leads in the right direction. It's like a map or a recipe. Not comparable to the way Schutz uses the idea of recipes. He's got something more rote than recipes are. Schutz must never have been an actual cook, because you can't follow recipes in as rote a way as Schutz is describing the man on the street following recipes and actually come up with something that you can eat. Anyway, so the recollection story can be considered as a map. So it leads us toward being braver, right? It's a map. It leads us toward being braver. It's leading the right direction toward virtue and toward knowing, at least toward striving to know, of knowing virtue. And like all maps, it's a lie, because a map isn't the territory. So true opinion isn't knowledge in that sense, right? True opinion is true the same way an authority might be. And for Socrates, that's not real knowledge. Any knowledge that's received knowledge is not true knowledge. True opinion is only true in scare quotes. So the true opinion, the myth of recollection, they are lies. A map is a lie that leads correctly. A recipe is a lie that leads correctly. I think there's an interesting connection you can draw between this true opinion / map / recipe myth of recollection that I'm declaring to be a lie that can make us virtuous. The problem is that in the wrong hands, it can make us vicious. There's an interesting connection to draw between that and socially approved knowledge in Schutz's sense. It's a pretty scary connection to make. Anyway, a last note for Plato fans. This dialogue suggests that the way to find out whether Socrates really was a gift from the gods is to do exactly what the Athenians did do, which is to kill him and see how Athens fares afterward. Because, if he really was a gift from the gods, and as a gift from the gods, he could guide them in the right direction, then they would be guided in the wrong direction following his death. Were they guided in the wrong direction? Well, frankly, they were already headed in the wrong direction when he was alive. So there's not much that we can really compare. Plus, how do we know what a right and wrong direction for a nation is? So, does this dialogue tell us what virtue is? No. Does it tell us what knowledge is? No. Does it tell us the difference between true opinion and knowledge? Yes. Does it tell us whether there can be knowledge of virtue? No. I think it's pessimistic about whether there's knowledge of virtue. And I think it intriguingly suggests that virtue arises from belief, and that belief can be a belief in a lie if the lie guides us in the right direction. And that's what I think the Meno is doing. Shazam.